I was halfway through my cappuccino at a tiny corner cafe in Soho, the kind of place where the windows fog up in the winter and the espresso machine hisses like it's alive, when a headline on my phone nearly made me spill the entire cup. Rising architect unveils revolutionary waterfront redevelopment plan. It was the photo beneath that headline that stopped my heart. A sleek, oversized presentation board stood on an easel, sunlight bouncing off its protective glass. I recognized it instantly, the greenway layout wrapping around the old ferry dock, the solar-lit walking path winding between restored brick warehouses, even the curved benches with slatted teak seats. I had drawn those benches by hand, experimenting for weeks until the proportions felt perfect. And standing beside the board, beaming under the camera flashes, was Caleb Morgan. My former assistant. My protégé. My friend. My pulse was suddenly too loud in my ears. It was surreal, almost cinematic, as if someone had taken my life's work, dressed it in a new suit and put it on display without my permission. I blinked thinking maybe I was wrong. But then I zoomed in on the photo. The color-coded zoning map in the background matched mine exactly, down to the shade of muted ochre-eyed picked to represent mixed-use residential. I knew that shade like a signature, because I'd mixed it myself on my old Wacom tablet one night at 2 a.m., trying to capture the warmth of brick in evening light. There was no mistake. It was my project. My vision. My years of research, my late nights, my entire professional gamble. And now, the internet and soon the whole city would think it belonged to him. I scrolled further into the article, my fingers cold despite the cafe's heat. The journalist gushed over Caleb's original concept and forward-thinking design philosophy, painting him as some sort of urban savior with an eye for detail and a heart for community revitalization. He was quoted talking about his years of study and personal passion for sustainable cities. Every sentence felt like a blade and I could feel my hands start to shake. The noise of the cafe faded away, the clinking cups, the low hum of conversation, even the street noise outside. All I could hear was the echo of our conversations in my studio, the casual way he'd leaned over my shoulder to help adjust a rendering, the way he'd asked me where I sourced my reclaimed wood suppliers, or how I calculated pedestrian flow in narrow corridors. I'd answered every question, thinking I was shaping the career of a promising young architect. I hadn't realized I was arming him for theft. The article mentioned something else. A public unveiling at the Metropolitan Pavilion in Chelsea, just 3 weeks away. There would be investors, city planners, and reporters. It would be his moment, his coronation. And my erasure. I sat frozen for a long moment, the cappuccino cooling untouched in front of me. The world outside the cafe window went on. Yellow cabs inching down the street, a courier on a bike cutting between cars, while inside my world tilted sharply off its axis. Finally, I pushed the phone away and pulled my notebook from my bag. On the inside cover was a post-it I'd written months ago, a reminder to myself, protect what you build. No one else will. It had never felt more urgent. My name is Rowan Ellis, and for the last 12 years, my life has revolved around designing spaces that feel as if they've always belonged, even if they didn't exist a year ago. I'm not some starchitect chasing magazine covers. I run a small but respected studio in Brooklyn, focused on sustainable urban renewal. My projects aren't just buildings, they're places where people gather, linger, and hopefully feel like they're part of something bigger than themselves. It's the kind of work that's invisible when it's done right. Nobody stops to think about who decided to place the bench under the ginkgo tree or who made sure the sunlight would fall across the plaza at 4 p.m. in October. But I know. And that's enough for me. Caleb Morgan came into my life 3 years ago, straight out of Columbia's graduate architecture program. He had a resume stacked with internships and volunteer work, but more than that, he had a way of talking that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. That kind of charisma is rare in our field. Most of us speak in CAD files and zoning ordinances. Caleb spoke in visions. He found me after a guest lecture I gave at his university. I remember the way he waited until everyone else had left, his sketchbook clutched in one hand. Your talk about reimagining public space. It was like you were describing the kind of architect I want to become, he said. I could see the hunger in his eyes. Not just ambition but something that looked like genuine respect. And I'll admit it felt good. I'd built my studio from the ground up with no family connections or flashy investors. I knew how lonely the climb could be, so I decided to take him under my wing. He started as my assistant, running site visits, organizing material samples, helping with renderings. But soon he was shadowing me in client meetings, sitting in on brainstorming sessions. I liked the way he listened, or thought I did. He'd tilt his head slightly, eyes narrowing like he was absorbing every word. We spent long nights in my studio, music low, the smell of takeout Thai food mixing with the faint scent of wood samples and ink from freshly printed plans. He asked the right questions. How do you decide which parts of a historic structure to keep? What's your process for balancing form and function when the budget gets tight? At the time, I answered everything without hesitation. I believed knowledge was meant to be shared. And Caleb had that quality that makes you forget to guard your secrets. The same quality con artists probably have, though I didn't realize it then. About a year ago, I finally started assembling my most ambitious proposal yet. A plan to transform a neglected stretch of the East River waterfront into a vibrant mixed-use district. It wasn't just about architecture. It was about rewriting the story of a neighborhood. I had collected 5 years of site analyses, environmental impact studies, and historical research. My hard drives were stuffed with layered CAD drawings, topographical surveys, and endless versions of pedestrian flow simulations. The project became my obsession. I'd wake up thinking about the curve of the riverwalk and go to sleep imagining the way the morning light would hit the restored brick facades. Caleb was there for almost all of it. He knew the suppliers I was courting for reclaimed materials. He'd seen the confidential correspondence with the city's urban planning committee. He'd even sat next to me when I fine-tuned the renderings that would end up on that pavilion display board. There were moments looking back when the air around him felt too still. Like the time he asked if I'd ever considered going into partnership with someone younger who could handle the networking while I focused on design. I laughed it off then, thinking it was just youthful confidence talking. If there were warning signs, I missed them entirely. 6 months ago I told him, half joking, that this waterfront plan could define my career if the city accepted it. I remember his smile. Wait, too wide maybe. It's going to change your life, he'd said. I thought he meant it in the way a friend would. Now I know he meant it literally, just not in the way I imagined. The morning after I saw the article in the cafe, I woke up with that same sick feeling in my stomach. The kind that makes coffee taste like ash. My phone was already buzzing on the nightstand. The first text was from a former client. Wow, Caleb's project looks amazing. I had no idea you two were still working together. The second was from an industry acquaintance I hadn't spoken to in years. Congrats on mentoring the city's next star. He really speaks highly of you. My chest tightened. Highly of me. The article had mentioned my name exactly once, buried halfway through the text. Rowan Ellis, a Brooklyn-based architect, is said to have influenced Morgan's early career. Influenced. As if my life's work was a mood board he'd glanced at once. By mid-morning, 3 more messages came in, each assuming I'd endorsed Caleb's vision. It was clear he wasn't just passing my work off as his own. He was building a narrative that I was quietly backing him like some benevolent shadow partner. I pulled up the article again, reading every line slowly this time. The technical descriptions of his design process were mine word for word. He even described the pedestrian flow algorithm I'd built myself as a proprietary model I developed in grad school. I remembered the night I'd explained that algorithm to him, diagramming it on tracing paper while he nodded thoughtfully. Anger started to cut through the nausea. But beneath it was a deep, sinking sadness, the kind you feel when you realize someone you trusted was never who you thought they were. By noon, I'd called my attorney, Meredith Cross. Meredith had been with me through 2 major contract negotiations and a brutal zoning dispute. She was sharp, unshakable, and allergic to nonsense. After listening to me describe the situation, she said, "Rowan, this isn't influence. This is theft. And not just professional, it's strategic, calculated theft." Her voice was calm, but I could hear the steel in it. "I'll need every file you have, CD drawings, renderings, proposal drafts, emails. Anything with timestamps." I spent the next 2 days in my studio surrounded by stacks of rolled drawings, USB drives, and my old sketchbooks. I pulled up render after render on my computer, each one tagged with metadata showing the exact date and time I'd created it. Every file felt like a small piece of my defense. Meanwhile, the calls and texts kept coming. A mutual acquaintance invited me to Caleb's unveiling event, since you two are so connected to this project. A city planner I'd once pitched to sent me a LinkedIn message praising my protégé's courage to take on such a large-scale redevelopment. It wasn't just the theft, it was the rewriting of the story in real time. I could feel my role shrinking in the public version of events, like I was being edited out of my own work. On the third night, unable to sleep, I found myself scrolling through Caleb's social media. His feed was full of behind-the-scenes shots. Him reviewing renderings, my renderings, him walking the waterfront site I'd spent years studying, him concept sketching on paper that looked suspiciously like my templates. In one video, he stood in front of a massive poster of the project, thanking everyone who believed in my vision, especially those who helped shape it in the early days. No names. No credit. Just a vague nod to the invisible architect behind the curtain. I remember sitting there in the dark, laptop glowing in the quiet of my apartment, and thinking, if I don't stop this now, he will own it. In the eyes of the city, the industry, maybe even the law. That's when Meredith called. "I've reviewed your documentation," she said without preamble. "Rowan, you have an airtight case. We can file for a cease and desist before the unveiling. But I think we should do more than that." I leaned forward. "What do you mean?" "Serving him privately will protect your work. Serving him in public will protect your name." The idea took a moment to settle. Public. In the middle of his event. In front of investors, city officials, and the press. My pulse kicked up at the thought, half dread, half electric anticipation. Meredith continued, "If he's been telling people you're behind him, the only way to break that narrative is to be there in person and make it impossible for him to spin. I know it's going to be messy, but it will be final." I didn't answer right away. My mind flashed through years of effort, late nights, the first sketches of the waterfront plan, the research trips, the trial and error modeling. And Caleb standing there in my studio taking it all in. Finally, I said, "Let's do it." The Metropolitan Pavilion in Chelsea has that particular kind of echo, the one you hear in spaces built for big moments. The walls were draped in crisp white fabric, the lighting warm but calculated, highlighting the massive display boards lined up like soldiers. Each one showed a different angle of the Morgan waterfront redevelopment project. My project. I arrived a few minutes after 6, the November air still clinging to my coat. The place was already buzzing, clusters of investors in tailored suits, city officials with name tags clipped to their lapels, photographers weaving between conversations, cameras poised for candids. Glasses clinked as waiters moved through the crowd with trays of champagne. Meredith walked in beside me, her presence like armor. Behind her, a tall man in a dark suit carried a leather portfolio, the process server. They were both calm, professional, but I could feel the static in the air. Somewhere in this room, my thief was basking in his stolen glory. And then I saw him. Caleb stood near the front stage, laughing with a group of investors. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my rent, a champagne flute in one hand. The stage behind him was set for the presentation. A podium, a large screen, and flanking it, 2 enormous renderings of the waterfront. Renderings I'd labored over for months. When his eyes found me, they lit up with what I can only describe as audacity. He walked over like we were old friends, arms open. "Rowan, I'm so glad you came," he said, pulling me into a hug I didn't return. "It means a lot to have your support tonight." Support. The word tasted like rust. I forced a polite smile. "The event looks impressive." He didn't notice my tone, or maybe he didn't care. "Come on, let me introduce you to some people," he said, gesturing toward a trio of well-dressed women. "This is the brilliant architect I've been telling you about, the one who inspired me to pursue this vision." I nodded to them, keeping my expression neutral. They smiled warmly, clearly under the impression that I was here to celebrate him. The part of me that still remembered mentoring him wanted to feel something. Pride, maybe. But all I felt was the weight of every sleepless night he had stolen from me. At exactly 7 o'clock, the lights dimmed slightly and a voice over the speakers announced that the presentation would begin. Caleb took the stage, smiling at the audience like he was born under those lights. He launched into his speech, all about his journey, the years of conceptual development, the inspiration drawn from the city's maritime history. Every phrase was like a warped reflection of conversations we'd had in my studio. He gestured to the renderings with practiced ease, pointing out design elements I had agonized over. As he spoke, I noticed movement in the audience. People checking their phones, whispers starting to spread. My phone buzzed in my bag, I didn't need to look to know it was the notification. Nadia Grant's exposé had just gone live. Waterfront deception: how a protégé stole his mentor's vision. I scanned the crowd. One of the investors Caleb had been speaking to earlier was showing her phone to the person next to her, both of them frowning. A city official glanced at the stage, then down at his own screen, lips tightening. Caleb didn't seem to notice. He was too wrapped up in his closing remarks, describing how the project would bring new life to a forgotten part of the city. And then it happened. Meredith gave a slight nod to the process server, who stepped forward just as the applause began. His voice was steady, carrying through the room. "Caleb Morgan, you are hereby served with a cease and desist order and legal notice for intellectual property theft." The words cut through the polite clapping like a blade. The room went still. Every eye swung from the man with the papers to Caleb, who stood frozen, the confident mask slipping. "What?" he managed, half laughing as if it were some kind of joke. I stepped forward, my voice clear and measured. "Those designs belong to me. I developed them over 5 years, documented every step, and filed for legal protection long before you ever presented them as your own." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Phones were lifted. Photographers aimed their cameras again, but now for a very different reason. Caleb's smile faltered entirely. "Rowan, we worked on this together." "No," I said firmly. "You worked for me. And I shared ideas with you in confidence, never granting permission for commercial use. You didn't just take my work. You rewrote the story to make it yours." Meredith handed me a folder and I held it up slightly. "For anyone in this room considering investment, I suggest you read the public record now available online. This project, as presented tonight, is built on stolen intellectual property." A few people were already gathering their coats. Others stood stiffly, avoiding Caleb's gaze. The champagne that had flowed so freely earlier now sat untouched on tables. Somewhere behind me, a camera shutter clicked 3 times in quick succession. Caleb tried to speak again, but his voice cracked. "Rowan, we can work this out. The time for that was before you stood here tonight and lied to every person in this room." The event coordinator, pale and visibly uncomfortable, approached the stage. "I'm sorry, but given the circumstances, we have to conclude this evening." As the lights brightened and the crowd began to disperse, I stepped off the stage, my heels clicking against the polished floor. Caleb remained standing there, papers in hand, his grand unveiling crumbling around him. For the first time in weeks, I felt my breath come easier. By the time I got back to my apartment that night, my inbox was a wildfire. The exposé had already been picked up by 2 architecture blogs and a local news site. Headlines varied, but the tone was the same. Rising star falls under theft allegations, waterfront vision not his own. The photos were brutal. Caleb frozen mid-expression, the cease and desist papers in his hand, and me standing a few feet away, calm and unshaken. Meredith had warned me that public cases can get messy, but this one moved fast. Within 48 hours, every investor had pulled out of the project. The Metropolitan Pavilion issued an official statement distancing themselves from Caleb, saying they had no prior knowledge of the dispute. City officials stopped returning his calls. The collapse wasn't just professional, it was personal. Friends he'd charmed for years suddenly wanted nothing to do with him. A few mutual acquaintances reached out to me privately, admitting they'd believed his version of events until they read the article and saw the documentation. For me, it was strange to feel both vindicated and exhausted. The victory was real, but so was the cost. Months of preparation, legal strategy, and public exposure had left me drained. Still, I knew I'd done the only thing I could. If I'd stayed silent, the truth would have been buried under glossy photos and carefully crafted speeches. 3 weeks later, I stood in a small conference room at City Hall, this time as the sole presenter of the waterfront redevelopment proposal. It was surreal. The same boards, the same renderings, but my name printed cleanly at the bottom. The committee approved the plan unanimously. The contract is now signed. Construction is scheduled to begin next spring, and I've brought on a team I trust completely. This time my files are locked behind multiple layers of security. My legal protections are airtight. And while I still believe in mentorship, I believe even more in boundaries. As for Caleb, the last I heard, he'd left New York altogether. Rumors say he's in Austin trying to start over. Whether he's learned anything from this, I can't say. But I do know this. The architecture world is small and reputations travel faster than blueprints. 6 months after the pavilion, I found myself walking along the East River on a clear morning, the winter sun bouncing off the water. I stopped at the stretch of waterfront that would soon transform into the project I'd dreamed about for years. It was still rough, cracked pavement, rusting railings, graffiti on the old brick. But in my mind I could see it as it would be. I thought about the benches I'd designed, the walking paths that would thread through native plant gardens, the view of the skyline at dusk. This was mine. Not because a piece of paper said so, but because I'd earned it. Every line drawn, every choice made, every late night spent imagining a place where strangers could feel at home. Some betrayals break you. This one forged me into something sharper, steadier. I learned that protecting your work isn't selfish, it's survival. And that sometimes the only way to reclaim your voice is to speak louder than the person trying to steal it. As I turned to leave, the wind picked up off the river, carrying the scent of salt and possibility. For the first time in months, the future felt wide open.